school is a time for friends, memories, and learning. But for some, it becomes a nightmare they'll never forget.
High school was supposed to be simple classes, friends, and after-school activities. But for Megan Thompson, her junior year at Willow Creek High School turned into something she could never forget. It all started in October when her AP chemistry teacher, Mr. Renshaw, suddenly fell ill and had to take a medical leave. At first, Megan and her classmates weren't too concerned. Everyone gets sick, after all. But what was odd was how quickly the school found a substitute. His name was Mr. Victor Gray, and from the moment he walked into the classroom, something about him felt wrong. Mr. Gray was tall, with sharp, angular features. His pale complexion contrasted starkly against his dark, outdated suit. But it wasn't his appearance that made the students uneasy. It was his eyes. They were too light, almost colorless, and they seemed to pierce right through anyone they landed on. When he spoke, his voice was slow and deliberate, carrying a strange, almost hypnotic tone. Megan had always been a diligent student. She loved chemistry and was excited to keep learning, even with a substitute. But from the first lesson, she noticed Mr. Gray never used the textbook. Instead, he wrote complex equations on the board, many of which she didn't recognize. "Pay attention," he said one day, his voice cold and clipped. "This is knowledge you won't find in any book." Megan raised her hand. "But this isn't in the curriculum. Where is it from?" Mr. Gray's eyes locked on hers, and for a moment, the room felt unnaturally still. "Curiosity can be dangerous, Miss Thompson," he said with a faint smile. Within a week, strange rumors began circulating about Mr. Gray. Some students claimed they saw him in the hallways long after school ended, muttering to himself in a language they didn't understand. Others said they'd found strange symbols etched into the desks in the chemistry lab, symbols that hadn't been there before he arrived. Megan tried to brush off the rumors as typical high school gossip. But one evening, while staying late to finish a group project, she encountered something she couldn't explain. The school was eerily quiet, with only the hum of the janitor's vacuum echoing in the halls. Megan was heading to her locker when she heard it. A faint whisper, her name repeated over and over. "Megan, Megan." She froze, her heart pounding. "Hello," she called out, but there was no response. The whispering grew louder, coming from the direction of the chemistry lab. Against her better judgment, Megan followed the sound, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. When she reached the lab, the door was slightly ajar. Peering inside, she saw Mr. Gray standing in the center of the room. The desks had been pushed aside, and on the floor, drawn in chalk, was a large, intricate circle filled with symbols. Mr. Gray was speaking in a low, guttural tone, his hands raised as if conducting some unseen force. The air in the room felt heavy, and Megan noticed that the temperature had dropped. Her breath fogged in front of her, and her legs felt like they were made of lead. She wanted to run, but she couldn't move. It was as if something was holding her in place. Then Mr. Gray turned around. His eyes weren't pale anymore. They were completely black, like two bottomless voids. He smiled, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. "You shouldn't be here, Megan," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. Megan let out a scream, breaking whatever invisible force had been holding her. She stumbled backward and bolted down the hallway, her only thought being to get as far away as possible. The next morning, Megan told her friends what she had seen, but they didn't believe her. Even when she described the symbols and Mr. Gray's transformation, they laughed it off as a prank or a dream. But Megan knew what she had seen. Determined to prove it, she returned to the chemistry lab during lunch. To her shock, the room was spotless. The desks were back in place, and there was no sign of the chalk circle or the symbols. When she asked the janitor about it, he just shrugged. Nobody was in there last night, he said. Megan decided to do some digging. She searched for any information about Mr. Gray but found nothing. No teaching credentials, no online presence, not even a mention of him on the school's website. It was as if he didn't exist. The final straw came a week later when Mr. Gray suddenly disappeared. The principal announced that Mr. Renshaw had recovered and would be returning to teach. No one mentioned Mr. Gray again, and when Megan tried to ask about him, her teachers acted confused, as if they didn't know who she was talking about. Months later, while helping clean out the school's storage room, Megan stumbled across an old yearbook from the 1970s. Flipping through the pages, her heart stopped. There, in a black and white photo, was a man who looked exactly like Mr. Gray, wearing the same dark suit. The caption read, "Victor Gray, Science Department," but there was something even more disturbing. In the notes section at the back of the yearbook, someone had written, "Do not trust Mr. Gray. He's not human." Even now, years later, Megan can't explain what she experienced. She's shared her story with a few close friends, but most of them think she's making it up. Still, she avoids going anywhere near Willow Creek High School, and she never looks at a substitute teacher the same way again. Some nights, when the wind howls outside her window, she swears she hears whispers, soft, chilling whispers calling her name. Megan, Megan, and deep down, she wonders if Mr. Gray is still out there, waiting for another curious student to stumble into his web of darkness. Lucas had always hated being the new kid. Moving in the middle of his junior year wasn't exactly the smoothest transition, and Maplewood High School wasn't making it any easier. The sprawling brick building felt more like a prison than a school, with its long, dim hallways and ancient lockers that creaked when you opened them. Lucas wasn't trying to stand out. He just wanted to get through the school year unnoticed. But fate, or more accurately, some bored seniors, had other plans for him. It all started one rainy Friday afternoon in October, just as the final bell rang. Lucas was stuffing his books into his locker when a group of seniors approached him. They were laughing, the kind of laughter that sent a chill up his spine. "Hey, new kid," one of them said. His name was Ryan, and he had the cocky grin of someone who thought he owned the place. "You've heard about locker number 237, right?" Lucas frowned. "No. Should I have?" The group exchanged knowing smirks. A girl named Jessica leaned in, her voice low. "They say it's haunted. No one's opened it in years." "Haunted?" Lucas echoed, raising an eyebrow. "Seriously?" Ryan clapped him on the back. "Oh, it's serious, all right. People say bad things happen when you mess with it. But hey, if you're not scared, why don't you open it?" Lucas hesitated. The seniors' grins widened, sensing his unease. He didn't want to be the target of their teasing for the rest of the year, so he shrugged, trying to look indifferent. "Sure," he said, hoping his voice didn't betray the knot forming in his stomach. The group led him to the far end of the hallway, where the lights flickered ominously. Locker number 237 stood apart from the others, its metal surface dented and rusted, the paint peeling around the edges. Unlike the other lockers, which had shiny new combination locks, this one had an old, tarnished padlock hanging from it. "Go on," Jessica whispered, her eyes glinting with excitement. Lucas grabbed the lock, his fingers trembling slightly. To his surprise, the padlock popped open without resistance, as if it had been waiting for him. He swung the locker door open, and an icy draft hit him, making him shiver. Inside, the locker was empty except for an old, dusty notebook sitting on the top shelf. Its cover was cracked and faded, with what looked like smudged fingerprints in something dark. Red. Maybe. "Take it out," Ryan urged. Lucas hesitated but reached for the notebook. As soon as his fingers touched it, he felt a strange jolt, like static electricity running up his arm. He pulled the notebook down and opened it, flipping through the pages. Each page was filled with the same phrase, written over and over in shaky, frantic handwriting. "Get out. What the hell?" Lucas muttered, his voice barely audible. The seniors leaned in, their laughter fading. Suddenly, the last page caught his eye. It wasn't filled with repeated phrases like the others. Instead, it had a single sentence written in bold, dark letters. "You can't escape." Beneath it was his name. Lucas froze. He hadn't written it. How could he? His hands began to tremble as he stared at the page, his mind racing for an explanation. That evening, Lucas couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over him. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the notebook sitting on his desk across the room. Just as he was about to drift off to sleep, a loud bang startled him. He sat up, his heart pounding. The sound had come from his closet. Probably just the wind, he muttered to himself, though his window was closed. He got up to check the closet, but as he reached for the door handle, it swung open on its own. Lucas stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat. The closet was empty, but there was something on the floor, something that hadn't been there before. It was the notebook. "No way," Lucas whispered. He had left it on his desk. He was certain of it. Gathering his courage, he picked up the notebook and flipped to the last page. The sentence, "You can't escape," was still there. But now, beneath it, a new message had appeared. "Return TO locker number 237. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. Lucas would find the notebook in random places around his house, on the kitchen counter, under his bed, even in the bathroom. He couldn't figure out how it kept moving, and no matter what he did, he couldn't get rid of it. One night, he tried burning it in the fireplace, but the flames didn't even singe the cover. The next morning, it was back on his desk, looking untouched. Then came the whispers. At first, they were faint, barely audible, like someone speaking in another room. But as the days passed, they grew louder and more distinct. "Lucas, Lucas." The voice was soft and chilling, and it always seemed to come from the direction of his closet. Desperate for answers, Lucas decided to confront the source of his torment. Late one evening, after the school had emptied out, he snuck back into the building. The hallways were eerily silent, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound. When he reached locker number 237, he hesitated. The air around it felt heavy, almost oppressive. Taking a deep breath, he pulled the locker open. Inside, the notebook was sitting on the top shelf, just as it had been before. But this time, there was something else. A photograph. Lucas pulled it down and stared at it, his stomach dropping. The photo showed a boy about his age standing in front of the same locker. The boy's face was pale and frightened, and written across the bottom of the photo in thick, black ink were the words, "He didn't listen." Suddenly, the locker door slammed shut, and the lights in the hallway flickered violently. Lucas turned to run, but his feet wouldn't move. The air around him grew colder, and he felt a hand on his shoulder. "Leave," a voice hissed in his ear, sending a shiver down his spine. The next thing he knew, he was standing outside the school, gasping for air. He didn't remember running, but somehow he had escaped. Lucas transferred schools the next day. He never returned to Maplewood High, and he never told anyone what had happened that night. But the notebook, it followed him.
Even now, years later, he sometimes wakes up to find it sitting on his nightstand. The words, "You can't escape," staring back at him. And sometimes, in the dead of night, he hears the whispers calling him back to locker number 237. Lucas tried everything to get rid of the notebook. Over the years, he had thrown it into rivers, buried it deep in the woods, and even locked it inside a safety deposit box. But no matter what he did, the notebook always returned. Sometimes it would be sitting on his nightstand, other times it would appear in random places: his car, his desk at work, even his gym bag. The worst part wasn't its persistence. It was what it did to him. Every time Lucas saw the notebook, his chest tightened. His mind filled with vivid flashes of locker number 237. Its peeling paint, the eerie glow, and the whispers that had haunted him ever since that night. The visions came without warning, often leaving him shaken and breathless. Then the nightmares began. In his dreams, Lucas found himself back in the dimly lit hallway of Maplewood High. The air was cold, the shadows impossibly long. Locker number 237 was always there, looming at the end of the hall like a predator waiting to strike. No matter how much he tried to resist, he was always drawn to it. The whispers would grow louder, and the locker door would slowly creak open, revealing the notebook inside. As he reached for it, cold hands would grab his wrists, pulling him into the darkness within the locker. He always woke up sweating, gasping for air. After nearly a decade of torment, Lucas decided he couldn't face it alone anymore. He started researching paranormal phenomena, desperate for answers. He scoured online forums, visited libraries, and even consulted self-proclaimed psychics, but none of them had a solution. Most of them thought he was delusional, and those who didn't only added to his fear. "It's an attachment," one psychic told him, her voice trembling. "Whatever it is, it's feeding off your fear. It won't stop until it gets what it wants." "What does it want?" Lucas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The psychic shook her head. "You already know. It wants you to go back." Lucas resisted the pull for as long as he could, but the whispers grew louder, invading his waking hours. They followed him everywhere, soft, sinister voices murmuring his name, urging him to return. "Locker number 237, they hissed. "You must come back." He finally reached his breaking point one night when he woke up to find the notebook open on his chest. The words, "It's time," were scrawled across the pages in thick, black ink, dripping as if they had just been written. Shaking with fear, Lucas knew he couldn't run from it anymore. He had to go back to Maplewood High and confront whatever was waiting for him. The school was abandoned now, its windows boarded up and its walls covered in graffiti. Lucas parked his car in the overgrown lot and stared at the crumbling building. The memories of that night came rushing back, and for a moment, he considered turning around and leaving. But the notebook was in his bag, and he could feel its presence like a weight on his back. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the rusted front doors and stepped inside. The halls were dark and silent, the air heavy with the smell of mildew and decay. His footsteps echoed eerily as he made his way toward the far end of the building. where locker number 237 awaited. As he walked, the whispers grew louder, swirling around him like a swarm of invisible insects. The locker came into view, just as he remembered it, rusted, dented, and ominous. The notebook in his bag seemed to vibrate, urging him forward. Lucas swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he reached for the locker's handle. The door creaked open, and inside, the notebook was waiting for him, glowing faintly in the darkness. But this time, there was something else. A small, dusty mirror leaned against the back of the locker. Lucas hesitated, his heart pounding. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. He reached inside and picked up the mirror, its surface cold against his skin. As he wiped away the dust, his reflection stared back at him, except it wasn't just his reflection. Behind him, barely visible in the dim light, stood a shadowy figure. Its shape was humanoid, but its features were distorted, its face a twisted mass of darkness with glowing red eyes. Lucas spun around, but there was nothing there. When he looked back at the mirror, the figure was closer, its hand reaching toward him. A sudden, overwhelming force slammed into Lucas, knocking him to the ground. The notebook flew out of his bag, landing open on the floor. The pages flipped wildly, and a deafening, otherworldly roar filled the air. The words on the page changed, forming a single message. "You're part of US now." Lucas tried to crawl away, but the force pinned him down. The shadowy figure emerged from the locker, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. "Why me?" Lucas choked out, his voice barely audible over the roar. The figure didn't speak, but its intentions were clear. It reached for him, its cold, inhuman hand gripping his wrist. In that moment, Lucas felt a rush of memories, images of other students, other victims, all of them lured to locker number 237. They had tried to resist just like him, but they had all failed. The figure's grip tightened, and Lucas felt himself being pulled toward the locker. He clawed at the floor, his screams echoing through the empty halls. As his vision blurred, he caught one final glimpse of the notebook. The last page had changed again. The words scrawled in blood-red ink, "Welcome home." The next morning, Maplewood High stood as silent as ever, its dark halls untouched. Lucas's car remained in the parking lot, its driver's side door hanging open. No one ever saw Lucas again. Years later, when a group of teenagers broke into the abandoned school on a dare, they found a single item in front of locker number 237, a dusty, old notebook. Its pages were blank, except for the last one. Who's next?